Welcome everybody to the Lemon Grove Community Gardens workshop series. Today we're going to talk a little bit about tree canopies and some climate equity markers, particularly for Lemon Grove. So we've invited Victoria Vasquez, a colleague of mine from the California Strategic Growth Council's Partners Advancing Climate Equity program. It's a training program that really has allowed us to network across the state, and it has also allowed us to really share our resources and bring them to our own communities. I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to really see what's going on across the state so that we can increase our collaborative efforts. So with that, I will ask that Victoria, if you'd like to show your presentation, and I'll do the introductions on your behalf. So today we're welcoming Victoria Vasquez. The title is Tree Canopy and Climate Equity. And Victoria, it comes to us from Sacramento, if you can advance your slide. And she is from Sacramento, and Victoria fell in love with Sacramento's tree canopy at a very young age, spending countless hours exploring the American River. As a single parent of 2 children with asthma, Victoria is passionate about creating equitable health outcomes for underserved neighborhoods by protecting, increasing, and maintaining their tree canopies and green infrastructure. Through community organizing, she connects local community members and groups with civic leaders and resource organizations to advocate for stewarding a healthy and equitable tree canopy. She connects with her community by leading a Girl Scout troop and serving as vice chair of the City of Sacramento Parks and Community Enrichment Commission. Welcome, Victoria. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you everyone for having me today and for joining us on a Saturday morning. It clearly shows that you care about your environment and your community, and that means that you have something in common with me. So I'm glad to share this space with you. And I'm coming to you from what I acknowledge was and is the land of the Nisenan people. And this land is at the convergence of 2 rivers. So the Nisenan people used to be were the original stewards of this land, and used our native oak trees for a lot of their lifestyle, right? They used native oaks as a staple food, acorn mush, and for everything that they needed here in the Sacramento Valley, which looks a lot different now. As you can see from this lush river view of my city's skyline, we can grow some pretty big trees here. So we have a lot of practice in Sacramento in working with tree canopy and all of the different health benefits that trees provide. You might have heard us called in the past the city of trees, because we are one of the world's largest hand-planted urban forests. So what does that mean when we talk about something like extreme heat that we're going to talk about today? Well, there's a lot of benefit that comes from trees, not just air quality, not just beauty, and not just food like lemons from Lemon Grove or nut trees, but also we have some really scientific effects when it comes to a hot summer day or a hot winter day, as we tend to have here in California. So obviously shade, right? Shade reduces temperature. And how does that happen? Well, the leaves of a tree shade the ground and the built environment like asphalt or cement, so they have less chance of absorbing that heat during the day. Because what we know about cement and asphalt is that in the evening, it shoots it back out into the environment, right? It literally radiates and emits back into the environment around it. So a cooler evening, even in the dark, is provided by that shade when it's received during the daytime. Evapotranspiration is a special tree quality, right? They bring the air out of they bring moisture out of the ground and out of the air, and then they literally almost like sweat it out. So there's a cooling effect underneath the tree when you're near it. It's actually releasing that moisture back into the environment that it's pulling in. Obviously, energy usage reduction is a big one. When you have a deciduous tree, which means that the leaves fall off in the wintertime, and it's placed with the right sun orientation and the right space from your home or any structure to shade it, then in the summertime, you're going to use less money to cool it if you have an air conditioning system. And in the winter, when those leaves fall off, the sun is going to have more access to your structure and you're going to use less money to heat it. So that means you're also going to, not only do you have a cost benefit, but you're using less energy. The health benefits of trees are manyfold. We know that if it's shady outside of your home or at your park, you're more likely to be outside and be comfortable. You're more likely to push your baby stroller down the street. You're more likely to jog. You're more likely to use a bike in a shaded bike lane. My daughters here in Sacramento on a hot day like to use chalk and draw hopscotch and play out on the driveway until the sun hits it, and then they're back inside. So all of these physical benefits are manifested by obesity, diabetes, allergy, anxiety. When you're not exercising, there's a host of ailments that you can be subject to. And we know in neighborhoods where there's less tree canopy, there's higher heat temperatures, and there's less shade, we have higher instance of all of these illnesses here in Sacramento. So as Anita mentioned in my biography, I am a community organizer here in Sacramento. I'm not an arborist. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an ist of any kind. All of this is my personal experience in implementing tree planting grants here in Sacramento in order to reduce those instances of disease, in order to clean our air and have better air quality in an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So what I do is create community trees, right? This is one of the neighborhoods that I work with to plant trees. So if we look at this neighborhood from an aerial view, we'll see a handful. I'll show you what I see as someone who plants trees to offset public health outcomes. The yellow line on the right is a rail. It's a train. It's like a light rail. And then if you come in a little farther, you'll see quite a large power line here. So there are power lines that run right behind this community, which is about 15 years old, and it runs to a power station right here. So we've got the train line, we've got the power lines, and then we have these backyards butting right up next to them. And you'll notice there's no vegetative barrier here. So there's no protection really for these residents from whatever pollution is going to be coming off of this train. We'll see that these are tree planting strips. So Sacramento, unfortunately, was one of the neighborhoods that was subject to redlining covenants in the past, which meant that we were not offering home loans to people of color unless they were in a certain neighborhood. And one of the ways that this manifested in Sacramento was that amenities like tree planting strips were not built into those neighborhoods of color as they were built and developed. So they have less trees. So this neighborhood, which is one of those formerly redlined areas of Sacramento, is righting that wrong of the past by building in these tree planting strips. But what you'll notice is there's no trees planted in them, right? So we're getting there, but we're not there. So what happens? We have solar on these homes. Excellent climate resilient strategy, right? We have building blocks that we're working with to create a neighborhood that is equitable and healthy. And then my personal guess is that these mature trees here, right at the entrance of this neighborhood, were probably planted when these model homes were built. This is my guess, that when you show the model home, when you put in the landscaping, when you're planning on building the rest of the trees, that's how these trees got to maturity at 15 years old. They match the park trees across the street, and it creates a completely different living environment for the people who live on this street. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about extreme heat, we talk about planning and designing a new neighborhood or maintaining an older neighborhood. Your life can be very different if you live on this street. If you live on this street, I know my daughters are going to play hopscotch all day, but if we live over here, they're probably going to want to play a video game, right? So let's see what that looks like down on the street and in person. This is the street near the power lines. And as you can see, this light structure here in this planting strip is casting shade all the way to that front door, right? So this tree has to be a little bit smaller because of its proximity to that solar and to the foundation of the house. I actually think it might be planted a little too close to this house. But if the tree was planted here, we would have more of an opportunity to shade that driveway, to shade your home. And if you look down the street, you can see how many opportunities are missed this adds up in regard to the temperature of your street. These are those what I call the model homes. So if you're walking down this street, obviously you can hang out in your driveway, work on your garden. You might talk to your neighbor or linger when you're pulling in your garbage cans. You're just more likely to be comfortable when you get in your car here in the summertime. And I mean, as you can see, they look like completely different neighborhoods. This is the same development, just the trees were not planted in the places they could be. Again, this is on the other side of that park. Look at the opportunity missed to shade that street where you're riding your bike when you see the shade cast by that light structure. In my neighborhood, it's a little different than Lemon Grove. Our city maintains these street tree strips. So if trees were planted here, they would be the ones to water them, prune them, and maintain them, as they do with these trees here in the middle. If you planted in your own front yard here in Sacramento, you would be responsible for that same responsibility of keeping your tree alive and healthy. So let's talk about equity in DACs and not DACs, right? So a DAC is a disadvantaged community as identified by CalEnviroscreen. So the state of California, I'm sorry, what did you say? Nothing. Okay. The state of California has taken all of our census tracts and determined their pollution burden. And that's through a variety of resource. It's through, what is your ozone? What's your particulate matter? What's your level of poverty? What is the demographic of all the ethnicities in your census tract? So if you look at the census tract here on the left in Sacramento, this is the outside of my daughter's school. And as you notice on the picture, the trees are on the outside of that fence. So these are technically city trees and they're maintained by the city of Sacramento. It's the same for the residence trees on the other side of the street, as they've worked out individual agreements with the city to maintain those trees. This community on the left is not a disadvantaged community. It's got a wealthier population financially. The neighborhood on the right is a school not even 3 miles south, but it is in what we call a DAC, right? We have poverty, we have crime, we have higher heat. And as you see, the trees are actually on the inside of this school fence, which means they were the burden of the school district to maintain. And they didn't have funding to do that. So as you can see, there's mistletoe, right? There's structural damage. And if you look at this street today, all of these trees have been removed as they became hazards without any proper maintenance over the years. So if you go to this school, you don't have any shade, but if you go to this school, you do, right? So maintenance matters. And how that plays out with extreme heat is in low baby birth weights. When we talk about pollution and how it affects our health, and when we bring in heat, which is the conversation here today, one of the most staggering differences in neighborhoods who experience extreme heat is lower baby birth weight. I think that mothers who are in extreme heat situations, who don't have access to regular air conditioning, right? If you're living in a disadvantaged neighborhood, maybe you can't afford it at night. Maybe you don't have it built into your home or your rental home. And if you have higher crime, you're less likely to open the window to get some fresh air. And when you're sleeping in your REM sleep, your body's ability to thermoregulate itself is impaired. If in an instance of extreme heat, your thermoregulator is not working the way that it does in an instance of extreme cold. So, scientifically, having that comfortability of temperature at night plays out in this way. And if we look at the numbers here, and this is in my city, if you live in the neighborhood here on the right, you have a 72% higher chance of having a lower baby birth weight, which is, I believe it's 5 pounds or less, than you do in the neighborhood on the left, which has 11% higher lower baby birth weights as compared to the rest of the state of California. So let's look at Lemon Grove. What do you guys have going on over here? This is a picture of your tree canopy on the right. It shows where all of your trees are, where they're grouped together, where they are and where they are not, and how that plays out according to the urban forestry map is that your instances in the census tract of poverty are about 62%, which is right on par with your asthma, which is about 66%. Where I live, we're at about 98%, where there's like that neighborhood on the right that I showed you. So here in Lemon Grove, you can find a lot of information online about your pollution burden and about the demographics of your census tracts. I would say by looking at this, you have a lot of opportunity to plant trees at homes. If you notice here on this map, you can kind of tell where trees are in the backyards, right? I'm noticing a lot more backyard tree activity than front yard tree activity. And I'm noticing that in developments where you can tell they were kind of all built at the same time, that when you've lost trees, they haven't been replaced. And we hear this a lot in Sacramento that people say, I'm on a fixed income, right? I'm retired. I had to pay $2,000 to remove that tree and the stump. I can't afford to do that again. And I'm afraid that I might have to water a new tree and it might cost a lot of money that I can't afford. Right. So when we get down to the details and the facts and offset that fear, we've calculated with our Department of Utility here in Sacramento that it's about $3 a month for the first 3 years of a tree's life, which is what it takes to establish a tree with a little extra watering, to do so. Right. So if you know the number and you're not afraid of, oh, it's going to cost more money in water, but you know, okay, it's going to cost me $3 more a month for the first 3 years, you're more likely to replace that tree. And then these numbers can maintain themselves because a tree has a lifespan. It's young, it's born, it's a teenager, it becomes mature, needs a little extra maintenance, a little pruning, and then it dies. So when the tree dies, if we're not replacing them, we're bringing ourselves to these places of extreme heat. We're losing that opportunity to spend less money on our energy. We're losing that opportunity to use less energy, and we're creating a hotter environment, right? Literally. And those hotter environments affect the health of ourselves and our neighbors. So I don't know if you're familiar with CalEnviroScreen 4.0, but this is a wonderful tool, census tract based as well. There are 2 versions of it. The first version was in this color coded red is bad and green is good. And if you look at statewide maps going forward, we're moving to a place where if you're colorblind, it's easier to read for you. So when you look at newer data on CalEnviroScreen, it's all in shades of blue because one color in different shades would be more accessible for someone with color blindness to read. But as you can tell from these pictures, here's Lemon Grove, you have a variety here of pollution burden. So if you live here in the census tract on the top, your low baby birth weights are at 57% higher than the rest of the state. And if you live here under Pacific Avenue and Church Street, 45% higher. So you can see just in the same city how different your physical health can be. Your public health benefits can be different. Your asthma is exactly the same between the two. And your cardiovascular disease is the same as well. So if you want to go to this website and see where your home is on this map, you can see how you are affected. And most importantly, you can see how are your neighbors affected? How are your neighbors' census tracts affected? And what can you do to improve yours? So again, this is the shading I was telling you about. So the maps look like this now. And the darker is the higher instance of the disease, and the lighter is the lower instance. So this is a screenshot I took of Lemon Grove for you about low baby birth weight because I believe in data-driven science. I believe in knowing exactly what's happening, and I appreciate people who research that for us. This talks to you a little bit about what is baby birth weight. And as you see on the left side of the screen here, you can open up this map in all of these different ways. You can say, what's our pesticide use? What's our traffic impact? And it will give you the same map according to your burden as compared to other California census tracts. So I did open up one more for you here, which is cardiovascular disease, because that one kind of caught my eye when I looked at the demographic of the age of your neighborhood, which you can also see on CalEnviroScreen. So Lemon Grove, if you live again above, like this is San Miguel I'm seeing here, you have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So we know that what we can do is plant trees to cool our air, to clean our air, to hold that storm water runoff, to provide shade, to provide habitat, to provide food. And in Sacramento, We do this very strategically. I personally have implemented 2 CAL FIRE grants. They're California Proposition 68 and California Climate Investment Based. The first grant, we planted over 3,000 trees in about a 5.5-mile area of southern Sacramento. And the second grant I'm working on will be about 2,050 trees. This is a large amount of trees to offset our numbers that were not looking very good for asthma. This is a Capitol Park here in California. It's here in my neighborhood in Sacramento, and it really is sort of a tree museum. You can walk around and see all the different varieties of trees planted here intentionally to show off California's trees. And if you're ever in Sacramento, I highly recommend a walk around Capitol Park. We've learned over the last 40 years, there's a local nonprofit here that's been planting trees, and they have a very cool idea of how they could fund it and how they could keep their tree canopy thriving, which I'll explain to you. But first I want to share, I know that you're working on in Lemon Grove planting trees. We have a lot of practice, and I want to share with you what you need to know. You need to know that the size of the tree does, in lots of instances, indicate the amount of pollution that it can sequester. Not all species are equal. Not all species grow well in every region. So I recommend to you finding a species that grows well in San Diego County, knowing in Lemon Grove, what kind of soil do you have, right? What kind of temperature do you have? And then finding a similar climate that's a little bit warmer. And you're going to want to find trees that grow well in that climate that's a little bit hotter. And you're going to want to plant them in Lemon Grove, because as climate change and global warming is getting hotter each and every summer, these trees are going to mature in about 15 to 20 years, and it's going to be hotter. Your summers will be hotter. So this is a long-term plan of a tree. You know, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. So we want to plant it today where it's going to be successful in 20, 40, 60 years. Some of the oaks here in California can be up to, 500 years old. So this really is some long-term planning. Biodiversity is really important. I know that you've been studying native trees, and that's really important. You want to pepper in some biodiversity. We have a neighborhood here in Sacramento called Elmhurst, and elms were planted in every front yard and in the green strip in between. And then they all caught Dutch elm disease, right? And that's a contagious disease amongst trees. You've got to make sure you've got some biodiversity. So if your trees do succumb to a disease, they're not giving it to their neighbor tree, wiping out a neighborhood, right? We see this quite often in Sacramento, where one tree was planted in all the front yards as a development was built and planted. And then they all die at the same time. And it's hard to regrow a canopy with that giant gap, right? So you're going to want to plant trees that survive a different level of years. And then you have a continuous canopy, because when we lose that canopy all at once, it takes 20 years to regain that health benefit that we're receiving. So you know that size is important, species is important. One thing I want to share with you is that proximity is important. This is my neighbor's tree across the street from my house here, and it was gorgeous and big and thriving. And I always thought it was a little odd that it had a little chunk out of it right here. Until this winter, when our utility company came through and came all the way down the street, cutting all the trees in half because they were a safety hazard for the power lines, right? If you are planted too close to a power line, our utility company, and I hope that yours would too actually, has to come through and clean up that hazard, right? And make sure that it's safe. So you have to plant your tree in the right proximity of other barriers to tree success, like a power line, an existing tree, a solar panel. You can have trees and solar. You just have to be spaced out appropriately. Underground utilities, the same thing, right? You want to make sure you're not hitting a power line or a cable line or a water line when you're digging. So for you, where you live, you can call 811 before you dig. Anytime you're doing a backyard or front yard, anything on your property, it's free to you. They will come on out and show you where all of your lines are under the ground, all of your utility, and then you can know where not to plant the tree. Maintenance is important, as I mentioned before. So this is a picture over the years in, I believe, 2007, 2015, and then 2021. This is that school that I showed you on the right that has lost all the trees. in a matter of 14 years, this neighborhood went from having beautiful tree-lined streets to going through a drought and losing trees, right? Losing that tree maintenance. Look at the bottom here. What a difference it must have been to live in this neighborhood within 7 years difference. And then another 7 years, trees are completely gone. And these neighborhood trees are completely gone. Most likely, they were very similar species. They didn't water during the drought, and they didn't have the funding on the front end of this school district, knowing, hey, in the future, we're going to have to maintain these trees. They didn't have the budget. They didn't write that into the front end. So as you are doing these tree planting initiatives and you're going on these tree journeys saying, we're going to help our health and our environment and our future by planting trees, know that you need to have some money to maintain them as they get older. Otherwise, your neighborhood can have this drastic difference in 14 years. And that's when the heat is there. And that's when your health is declining. So I want to share with you a strategy we've used in Sacramento. I mentioned a nonprofit. They honed in on this idea of the right species, the right place every single time. So what they do is use community foresters to come on out to a home, a business, a park, a place of worship, public or private property, and they help you choose the right species of tree. They show you exactly on the ground where to plant it by measuring out the distance of that species to the nearest sidewalk, the foundation of a building, a solar, a power line. And they say, okay, this is the formula for your property to be successful. And then they engaged the local utility district, which here is called the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, or SMUD. And SMUD funds the trees and the community foresters. So for several decades, this partnership has produced last year over 11,000 trees. The utility company funds the nonprofit with the expertise. They come out to your property, they help you plant the right tree. And then through the funding of the utility district, they deliver that tree completely for free to the property. So for the community, there is no charge. And this is in an effort to use less energy. We lost Rancho Seco. I don't know if you remember that in the 80s when our power plant started leaking. We had to shut it down. We needed to use less energy. So the utility district said, you know what? Instead of going out and buying more energy or building another plant, let's use less energy by using trees to offset those energy uses. Because it gets really hot where I'm from. I know it doesn't get as hot where you're from, but this is a strategy that we're using. And as we're all getting hotter, I think it can be a good model for any city in California. So where I come in is taking that funding that's coming from the utility district, working with the nonprofit, and then acquiring additional funding so that we can reach our most vulnerable census tracts, like those red neighborhoods that I showed you and the dark blue ones, the ones that are most vulnerable to climate change because they already are suffering the effects. You don't have to, knowing that in the future it's going to be worse. These are the ones we want to prioritize. This is where we want the trees to go. This is where we want the education to be. And this is where we want our community members to feel that stewardship. So what I do as a community organizer through the grants I mentioned earlier is I take that resource from the utility district with the education from the nonprofit, and I work with the community members. I work with neighborhood associations. I work with churches. I work with schools. I work with neighbors. And what I tell them is, there's a resource here for you. Did you know your coronavirus numbers? Did you know you have lower baby birth weights? And did you know that you're paying the same amount of tax for lighting and landscape as those neighbors who are having their trees maintained, but you don't have any planted? Why is that? Why is that inequity happening to us? And how can we fix it? How can we work together to speak with our city council to make sure that they're making it an even playing field, that they're maintaining trees in our neighborhood, as well as the ones that are not financially disadvantaged or not suffering these high asthma rates? And so this picture on the right here is a very special planting that I was able to host with this community. The people in green shirts, they are the United Latinos nonprofit. They created a green team. So in the language that was for their neighborhoods, which was Spanish, they're able to, they've learned the benefits. They've got a small path from my grant to go out and print the t-shirts and have the flyers and translate some materials and be able to host a planting event. The person in the red shirt is with Asian Resources Inc. And his property got a small pass-through grant from me. They bought a community center, and as you can see, the ground is just completely barren here, and those power lines behind them, right? We're in this situation again where we have something butting up to something with no barrier to protect our health, to protect our heat. So they planted a row of trees. They trained on this property, I trained the green team as to how to teach other people to plant trees, right? There's an appropriate depth. There's the proximity I was telling you about. There's a watering schedule. There's a maintenance schedule. So with their grant, we were able to teach them how to teach others this same messaging and how to literally plant trees, where to get the resources, how to apply for a CAL FIRE grant. This tree in particular was after a shooting last year in Atlanta, Georgia, which we connected to some hate against our AAPI community. And so they planted this tree in honor of the victims, and they named it Atlanta. And all of the participants that day tied ribbons and wishes of hope for their community to this tree. Right? This was a community-led collaboration of two nonprofits and my CAL FIRE grant and a nonprofit and utility district. So you see that we can all come together in this place where trees are offering emotional healing. They're offering literal air quality improvement. They are in the neighborhood that they live in. So when they drive by and the tree is losing water or it's starting to fail or it's looking sick, then they know who to reach out to say, hey, this tree isn't doing well. Let's improve our community together. That stewardship is really the piece that a municipality can't provide in a way that a neighborhood can, because it's the neighbors who are receiving the benefit from the tree. And it's most important to them that it survives. So being able to tangibly plant those together is a very successful recipe. This is a picture of their Facebook page. Look at the pride and the happiness and the joy that this nonprofit is experiencing planting this tree. And this is just one tree in a row of trees that they planted at this community center. But it is a collaboration of diversity, right? They have youth, students here planting. They have elderly, senior members of United Latinos planting, and they have a feeling of strength, right? A feeling of excitement. And now they've gone on to receive their own funding to continue their own tree planting projects. And this is something that can be easily achieved when you have the expertise. Trees bring people together. This is one of my favorite pictures here in Sacramento. That's our wonderful skyline. And this is our ballpark. And at first glance, you might see our skyline and the ballpark and some mature trees. But if you look really closely, you can see underneath those trees are all the people who bought a ticket for the game that day. They literally, these trees brought people together. And this is how Sacramento's heat can be solved. So I just want to kind of stop there and ask you, do you have any questions for me? And what can I answer for you? What are you guys doing in Lemon Grove? Let's have a conversation.
Thank you. That was so informative and really helpful. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you have a question, raise your hand or go ahead and just unmute yourself. One of the things that I put in the chat was that I know one of the greatest challenges that Lemon Grove has with respect to health and safety is not having complete sidewalks, not having sidewalks on the streets, right? So when I look at sort of, oh, look how nice it is that there's no trees, but there's a place to plant the trees, it kind of resonates with me in saying, I don't know what the challenge to address first is. Do we get the sidewalks to plant the trees on the sidewalks? Do we utilize the fact that we don't have complete sidewalks to actually create tree canopies, right? The hardest part is really the accessibility for community members who want to be more active, the accessibility for individuals who might be disabled and in needing in need of some sort of maybe power motor, a wheelchair, a walker. So we are challenged in that way with like lining our streets, right? I don't know if you have any idea about how to marry the two. Tree planting and sidewalking, are they connected or are they not? Perspective,
Yes,
perhaps.
yes, they are connected. And every city is a little different as to what they have. We do have some neighborhoods where the grass goes all the way to the street. So neighbors are walking in the street, but they're not neighborhoods that you would drive through to get to another neighborhood. They're kind of offset. ADA is a really big deal. You know, the accessibility for someone with a disability to be able to use a walker, or even in my, you know, just pushing a stroller, right? You don't have to have a disability to require a sidewalk. It's a safety issue. It's, you know, having a bike lane and a street and a sidewalk, right? You're losing that space to drive if your community is already built out. So that comes into play when people are talking about it. There's nothing from stopping you of planting that tree in your front yard, right? So as I said, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, right? Plant the front yard trees now as you're working out your sidewalk situation, as you're working out, yes, we need ADA compliance and we want shade built in because we know that our health is declining as the heat is increasing, right? So you have a lot of cases there for planting your front yard trees, getting your sidewalks worked out, putting something like active transportation in, which is good for everyone's health. I'm not going to ride. What's more important? I don't want my daughters riding their bikes to school on streets that are cluttered with cars and in a drive-through neighborhood that doesn't have a bike lane, right? I'm going to tell them drive right on the sidewalk, which is illegal. But I'm going to tell them to do that because I'm too nervous, or I'm going to get in the car and I'm going to drive on there. And then I'm emitting greenhouse gases, right? We're not in a place where we know that we're in a place where active transportation is important to our environment and to our health. So I would say to you, both are interconnected. When you are working out those sidewalks, making sure that tree wells are planted into them, and start planting those front yards now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, in the planting strips, where in sidewalks, they're not obviously that big. They don't go out to the tree, the drip line of the tree, right? They're just more around the trunk. How is watering the trees? First of all, is that generally done by the city? I think you said early on who maintains those trees in the planting strips, and I missed it. Is it the city that maintains them or the homeowners? And if so, how does a tree get enough water when it's a relatively small area that's being watered?
It's a great question, and thank you for asking it, because it's something I wanted to bring up for Lemon Grove when I looked at your Google Earth imagery, is that your parking lots are quite barren of trees. And trees can exist in cement, which didn't make sense to me when I came into this line of work. And that was the first question I had for our arborist. How do trees get water if they're surrounded by cement? And her advice was to get as close to as you possibly can to that drip line, and the roots are going to do the rest. So choosing the right species of tree to go into a planting well is number one that doesn't have far-reaching roots, one that doesn't have a wider canopy. Number two, what is the width of the well? Is it 3 feet? Is it 4 feet? Is it 6 feet? Because that's 3 different species that you're going to be able to update in that well. In Sacramento, some of our tree wells in our parking lots or in our tree strips are irrigated. The ones that are not, they have a watering truck that the city inside the city or the county outside of our incorporated city comes around and waters with the watering truck for the first 3 to 5 years. And then from there, we depend on the rainwater. Some species need water all the time, right, for the rest of their lives. And that's not a species that you're going to want to put in a parking lot, right? So knowing, is this species a low water use or a high water use? If it's a high water use, I'm not going to put it somewhere where it's surrounded by cement. 3 to 5 years of deep watering is important. And that deep water is slow water. So what we recommend is like a 5-gallon bucket with a little tiny hole drilled in the side of it. You fill it up, put it next to that tree, and that water's going to slowly saturate the ground, and then the roots will grow down to get the water. If you're using the sprinklers and it comes up on the top, your roots are going to grow up to the top, and your tree is not going to be as stable as it could be, right? So those first 3 years of deep watering are really important. We have an ordinance in the city of Sacramento, actually the county as well, that our parking lots are required to be shaded 50% within the first 15 years. When we're building a new parking lot, going through the permitting process, they have to show what species are you using, how big is that well, and how are you going to water that for the first 3 years. They give the urban forestry department gives them a staking guide to show them how to stake the trees appropriately. And then this is where we start to fail, right? We've started with this idea, this ordinance, but then the enforcement starts to fail, right? We don't really have the resource or the capacity to go back in 5 years and say, okay, is it shaded? Or in 10 years, right? Maybe it's changed ownership. Is it shaded? As the trees die out, are they replaced? Right? These are things that you should think about if you're going to do a parking lot ordinance, which I think you should. I was looking at your Goodwill parking lot and your Home Depot parking lot, and I was just noticing a complete lack of strips built into what look like some newer parking lots. That's a really great opportunity to avoid a heat island effect. And the heat island effect is when you have those larger swaths of cement that are capturing that heat during the day and then shooting it back out. We also have research that shows parking lots with more trees have a 30% more likelihood of sales, right? That people are more likely to shop somewhere where their car is shaded here in Sacramento. So knowing that maybe could help you if you're interested in having Lemon Grove make a parking lot shade ordinance, which I think we should. I also noticed on your climate action plan for the city of Lemon Grove that you contract with West Coast arborists to do some of your tree maintenance for your tree inventory. And you can look that up too and see how many trees does your city own? How many are they maintaining and where are they? In my city, it became very apparent quickly that the trees were maintained in the richer neighborhoods and not the poorer neighborhoods. And so if we can fix that and plant some more trees in the poorer neighborhoods, then maybe we can even out those health outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. And we also use West Coast arborists. They're fantastic.
Yeah, I think one of the other issues that really resonates to the top is twofold: is land ownership and home ownership, right? And the ability to be able to do these things in your own community. We do have several families, and most of the families that are of lower income or would be selected as disadvantaged are not homeowners, right? Mm-hmm. They might be renters. And so one of the tips that you gave us is that you don't necessarily have to be a homeowner in order to plant some of these trees. Getting permission is important though. So I think that resonates very strongly in terms of our community and our community's ability to want to do these things, not knowing if they have rights or access to do those things. So that's actually the education and the edification kind of work that you've been doing that could really be, that is really needed in our community here in Lemon Grove. But I think also the budget conversation about front loading the city's budget. Lemon Grovians kind of know that the budget conversation is almost the only conversation that happens, and it's a deficit-based kind of conversation. What we don't have and why we can't do the things and front load these opportunities. So I do think that sometimes when we're thinking about these programs and sometimes when we're thinking about what we can do with our city, helping them find the money and implement the programs is something that is really needed, and I've heard pretty frequently from leadership. So the 2 points that you made are very important for our community to hear, especially those of us that are active in the community and want to see some of the change. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, and rely on those utilities, right? Everyone has climate goals. And everyone can participate in planting trees to reach their climate goals, whether they're air quality, heat island mitigation, public health.
Yeah, so we're grateful for San Diego Gas and Electric, who did provide us the funding in order to be able to do these programs, to do this particular program or the workshop series, and to give away the trees, right? So we're absolutely very grateful for that. I really like the idea of really looking into some CAL FIRE, and maybe there are some collaborative agencies or institutions, maybe even somebody like the library that can help steward some of these programs and funding, that it doesn't rest on the city completely. And more
Yes.
importantly, I don't know those that are listening, that the largest landowner in Lemon Grove is not the city. It's the school district. So really that's where a lot of the work is. They own the properties that, and they have probably more consistent budget income than our city. So
Yeah.
it's really important to know that the institutions, and then the next largest landowner is the churches.
Mm.
Yeah.
Huh.
So
Right.
those are your go-to, right? So when you're talking about who can access those services, if some of those can go towards your faith-based community members and your school district can help steward some of the funding, I think that would be a great opportunity for Lemon Grove to really include those kind of joint and collaborative models of funding.
Yeah, and both of those places have built-in stewards. You have people there regularly can water those trees. Right? Students and congregants.
In the summer, it's like you'd act like everyone moves out because there's nothing.
Are you all at the beach? What's going on down there, Sandy?
Well, the schools are closed, and so there's limited maintenance, and I think that that's kind of one of the that has always been sort of the conversation. We do have some joint use agreements. It's about the availability of the staffing to be able to monitor and manage, and it's the same conversation with school gardens, right?
Oh,
But
yeah.
Walt has been working with school gardens, so maybe he can share a little bit more about how those are maintained over the summer, and that can give us some insight. Walt, do you have any idea about school garden management?
The two schools that I was involved with doing a school garden just closed up for the summer. They were not open in the summer. So yeah, they grow three seasons of the year and that's it. And they don't have a drip system in there yet. The third school that I was giving advice to was going to put in a drip system so that they could be, but they hadn't made a commitment to leaving it open during the summer. Because they don't have usually a summer program. Two of the schools in Lemon Grove have a summer program, but the rest don't. But I think that if the school can get in a drip system and then have it open during the summer, yeah, they can have it. But the trees usually are on a separate drip system, and I think that the schools maintain that all year, so it's not a big issue. And I think that getting trees out to schools as well as what we did this year was to the city, to the Little League, and to residents, I think worked well. We planted 50 trees here in Lemon Grove successfully. And so I think if we can go to the schools and the churches, I think that's a great idea.
Congratulations on your gardens.
Thank you.
Thanks. Victoria, you mentioned the bucket with little holes in it for slow watering. That's kind of localized to one area. I mean, is that okay to water a tree just kind of in one spot? I mean, a lot of times I'll put a hose with just on drip by a tree, or is it important to kind of move that around so that it waters more evenly?
Yeah, absolutely. We want even watering, and it depends on the age of the tree. So the deep watering process I'm describing is for the first 3 years, maybe to 5 years if it was especially small when it was planted, because that's where the roots are, right? They're in that little circle right around where the farthest branch is, so a little closer to the trunk. So you would use this slow watering method on one side of the tree, and the next time you water it, which is 2 or 3 times a week, on the other side of the tree, you're just going to keep moving that bucket around.
I see.
Yeah, or you can use a fan sprinkler as the tree gets more mature, which has like a little fan on the top, and those are for watering in a circle to get that drip line. So yeah, the younger tree method of the tree bucket, you do want to move it around. You can also just leave your hose on a trickle. Here in Sacramento with our drought, you can get a fine for, just leaving your hose out without an attachment on a trickle. But please hear this. By executive order, young trees are not subject to any watering fines in the state of California. So if your neighborhood, you can get a fine for watering your grass on a certain day, you can never get a fine for watering a young tree or a mature tree. Trees are exempt from every watering schedule. And that comes down from Governor Newsom.
All trees.
All trees, yes. And this was a recently reinstated order with our new drought order that came through, but this has been in place for many, many years. And we see that, like when I showed you the picture of the school district that lost all of their trees, in Sacramento, we believe that many of our trees were lost during the drought because this messaging was not shared. Because the messaging you got at home was, you're going to get a fine for this, you're going to get a fine for that. But it never said, but you can water your tree. And so we've worked on that. And the nonprofit I mentioned has made a deal with the district, our utilities district, that the messaging would be different this year. And so the messaging that we have this year is a picture of a little cartoon tree and a picture of a lawn, and it says, stress your lawn, not your trees, right? And they're sharing this messaging because think about how many trees we could have kept if we knew that during the drought, that our trees were so important to our health, but they were exempt from that fear of a fine. So please do not ever be afraid. Now, if letting your hose trickle without the attachment, check and see if that will give you a fine, because that's why we use the bucket method.
I see. Thank you. Moving forward into the future with the Colorado River drying up and whatnot, is there some focus on getting the more drought tolerant tree varieties, just kind of looking down the road with global warming and water shortages in California? Is there that kind of thinking?
Absolutely. I'm not an arborist again, but I think they're very amazing in the research that they do as to which trees survive best. So I can say for Sacramento, we look at places like Tucson, Arizona, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, because we find our regions to be similar, but they're hotter. So we are now putting in things like Bubba desert willow trees or laurel trees, shoestring acacia trees. So finding those species that grow well where you are might take a little bit of start, right? Because who would have planted a Bubba desert willow in Sacramento? It didn't make sense before. So now we're reaching out to other nurseries in different places. And I think there's this nationwide trend that these heat tolerant trees, like a pink flare cherry tree, they're going to be in higher demand. So we're going to start to see them become more available as more municipalities and regions are looking for them. So I think, absolutely there are species that survive in hotter climates than where you are, and you should start finding out what they are, which would be different from where I live.
On the other end of the spectrum, what's your feeling about putting in fruiting trees that will provide more food equity and food security and things like that? I mean, I don't think you mentioned too much about fruiting trees. And I like the idea of fruit-bearing trees, so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
My thoughts are absolutely yes. Food access is quite an important issue. And my presentation was focused on extreme heat, which we conquer with a shade tree as opposed to a fruit tree. But yes, I think the vitality of a fruit tree grove, a fruit tree planting, a fruit tree initiative is quite important. Fruit trees and shade trees coexist. It's not like a community garden where you want 100% or like 50% shade on some of your crops, so you don't want a big tree nearby. With many varieties of fruit trees, we want some shade, like a citrus tree. So, agroforestry is something where you would plant, a large shade tree, a smaller fruit tree, and then the crops that are appropriate right underneath. So you're creating that ecosystem. You're creating, the insects that are beneficial to all three. And the reason that fruit trees are not really mentioned in this conversation is that they don't sequester a lot of carbon. And that's how my grants are based, right? The number of metric tons of carbon I sequester is how I verify a CAL FIRE grant. So a fruit tree is not going to be a competitor or contender when it comes to that heavy hitting carbon sequestration. That's a contender when you're looking for these food access grants, a healthy neighborhood, healthy nutrition. That's where you can get your fruit trees in. They do require more water. They require some more maintenance. They require a little bit of compost and a little bit of knowledge. So one of the pass-through grants that I offered was to a fruit tree expert. And what he did was went to neighbors' homes, and he typically would charge $50 an hour for the service, but through the grant that he received for free, he was able to offer that knowledge. He did some hands-on pruning with the families. He did some hands-on broad forking on the ground around to loosen it up, showed them what compost is, taught them about worm castings and how they can find them, and then came back a second year after that initial pruning to see how it was going, practice the pruning again. And then those residents in perpetuity have the knowledge to maintain their fruit trees. So I highly recommend it. I'm a big fan. I wish I lived in a place called Lemon Grove because I think that's maybe my favorite fruit tree. We do grow some pretty big fruit trees here in Sacramento, and they just don't come into play when we're talking about greenhouse gas reduction funding grants.
Why is that? What's different about them?
They're much smaller trees and they don't sequester as much carbon. They just provide a different benefit.
I see.
Yeah, if you're talking about shade too, like if you a fruit tree, you want it, for me, I want it to be a little shorter because I'm not very tall and I can't get the fruit off the tall limbs, right? You want it to have some space between it and like a fence or a house so that you can walk around it and maintain it and harvest the fruit. So they're smaller trees in nature. You're not really sitting underneath them for shade because you want them a little shorter in nature. And they don't sequester as much carbon. I will say, I don't know where you are in proximity to fire. We have a heavy fire season in Sacramento. Even though we don't catch on fire, we're surrounded by forest in a valley. So all of that debris and that ash comes and sits in a layer on top of us. Our skies will literally turn orange here during wildfire season. And even before COVID, we were wearing masks during fire season because of the ash and debris in the air. I will stick your fruit tree leaves. That's quite a benefit, right? They're capturing that debris. Any tree leaf in your canopy is stopping that ash and that debris, ozone and the PM2s, all of those things. The stickier the leaf, the broader the leaf, the more surface area of the leaf, the more its ability to grab that out of the air or just capture it before it comes down into your house, into your lungs, into our neighborhoods who already have higher asthma rates, right? So a fruit tree, I again, I'm not a scientist, but I would argue that any leaf is a good leaf during wildfire season.
Wow. So much information. I think we could go on and on. I think this is really helpful. I think that what you're sharing is very tangible. It's very practical for us to be able to create opportunities within our own respective communities, maybe even our districts, or even amongst our each other to really think about how do we support bringing in some additional funding to our region so that we can do all the things that need to be done and not ask the same thing of the people that are already overtaxed and underpaid. Right? I think that's always the challenge here. Does anyone have any final questions?
In terms of carbon sequestration, wood chips is a huge resource whenever trees are trimmed, which can be an ongoing long-term process, right? How do using those chip, the tree debris, how does that play into the carbon sequestration programs, if it does at all?
Oh, absolutely. It's a big tree maintenance benefactor, right? The tree sustains itself by using that mulch that is chipped natural wood around the base. And that helps to create a darkness underneath for the insects to come through. And then when the insects are in the ground under your mulch because it's dark and cool, then they're creating tunnels for the water and air to get to the roots, which is great. Holding in that water in time of drought is great. creating a warmer layer in the wintertime, right? It's naturally decomposing, it's providing nutrients and softness to the soil. So the way that West Coast Arborist does it, who's contracted with your city, is that when they maintain these trees and they pull down the branches or a tree dies, they chip it all up and they give it back to you for free, right? I call West Coast Arborists all the time and I say, hey, I've got a school planting 20 trees. And I'm like, we're there. And they come and they offload those chips. And then my volunteers carry the chips to the tree and mulch the trees. And that is because the more carbon sequestration, okay, all that carbon that went into that tree when it gets chipped comes back into the environment, right? So not only do we need that layer to come right back where it's supposed to go, but also they have to pay to put those into a landfill if they don't offload it somewhere. The best thing you can do is to, with a fallen or felled tree, is to donate it to a lumber yard to be milled into slabs or some sort of dimensional lumber. When you do that and you're maintaining the integrity of the wood, the carbon is kept inside. So here in Sacramento, we have an amazing program called the Urban Wood Rescue, where these felled logs are donated, they're milled, they're dried in a kiln, and they're put back out for sale. So you can actually buy your own local wood, keep that carbon inside, not send it through the chipper, right? We want as few trees as possible to go through the chipper.
That's
And our
amazing.
utility district gives out the mulch for free as well. You can go pick up as much as you want at any time.
Wow, that's fantastic. Because then the chips don't break down anaerobically and they don't produce the methane, right? Because they're out there in the air and you don't get that methane production, right? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's fantastic to hear. Yeah. I'm going to be building a house too, so I'm very interested in the lumber aspect. Yeah. So
Well, thank you for that. Thank you, John. Thank you, Walt, Jackie, Pat, Ms. Charlotte, for joining us. We will be, this will be recorded and we'll be sharing with our membership and our other members listserv. So hopefully we'll get some more views. So we'd love to have you again sometime, Victoria, at least here in San Diego. So don't be surprised if you hear from me again. And thank you all for joining us today.
thank you very much, Victoria.
Yes, thank you. That was wonderful.
Yeah, Victoria, thank you. And I did see your video on your Sacramento Trees project, and that was great too.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again, Jackie. Even I see your picture, but I've seen you before. Hello.
Hi, I was sitting here the whole time you were talking, like, I know that voice, I know that face. Yes, thank you. It was a great presentation and nice to hear it reiterated again in the urgency for trees to be planted. And when you said the best time to plant trees was 20 years ago, I still stuck on that. Like, I just got in Lemon Grove like about maybe 23 years ago. So who would have known or thought about that?
Yeah.
Excellent
the
point.
last time, thank you. The last time I saw you, you asked a great question about beauty. I had said beauty is the B word in this industry, and it really was grant focused. And so of course trees are beautiful. I've never seen an ugly tree. All trees are gorgeous and beautiful. But when it comes to that grant funding, think outside the box, right? Like if you're looking for a neighborhood equity grant, yes, trees can offer beauty and satisfy that requirement. If you're looking for a food access equity grant, yes, fruit trees are going to satisfy that, right? Like I was saying, everybody has their climate equity goals or their other goals that trees can tie into because they are so multi-benefit. So you really made me think with that last question, Jackie. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for showing up. And Anita, thank you for pinging me in.
Yes, no problem.
Good luck with your gardens. Good luck with your trees. It's wonderful to share this time with you this morning.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.